The Russians, first of all, their casualties have spiked around Kharkiv, so as we can tell, so they're well in excess of that sort of 1,000 a day that they were previously suffering and could sustain. The second thing is, whilst their industry and both their munitions production and their materiel production has gone up considerably, a significant chunk of that, and our researchers estimate around 80%, of the vehicles and material coming on the front line is refurbished. So they're pulling stuff out of stocks. And it seems possible that by the time you get deep into 2025, they'll have to do another industrial reset. Because at that point, they'll have to start producing new artillery. For example, artillery barrels are a key challenge alongside munition. Well, they're going to have to start producing new ones. They're going to have to start producing new armoured vehicles because they're going back as far as the 1960s for some of what they've been pulling out literally of museums. And that's where the Ukrainians, if they can build up a sufficiently resourced and well-trained force, could potentially make headway if they can learn the lessons of 2023.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Matthew, thank you very much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Good afternoon.
Just to begin with, can you give me your assessment on where you think we are in this war at the moment?
So overall, what we are seeing is some of the consequences of what happened last year in terms of the Ukrainian counteroffensive falling certainly short of expectations, and the delay in some of the Western support coming in, which means that the Russians are now effectively on the attack. They haven't launched a single offensive, but they are essentially probing along the full length of the sort of the 1,000-kilometre front line, and they are making use of some of the advantages that they have built up over time, and some of the disadvantages and some of the challenges that Ukrainians have faced, predominantly in ammunition, in training, and their ability to prepare their defences. And so there's this window of opportunity that the Russians are taking advantage of, particularly after their mobilization.
And do you see the delay in Western aid as directly correlated with what we're seeing on the front line now, particularly in the northeast of Ukraine?
So to a degree, and it's certainly a contributory factor. I mean, there are two things that the Ukrainians would have been wanting to focus on, and that is physical defences, so putting in place fortifications, obstacles, and other barriers to mirror essentially what the Russians had in place last year, and personnel. And that's a recruitment and a training challenge for the Ukrainians, which is that they've got to generate more forces, partly to replace casualties, but partly also to address some of the challenges they had last year, which is that they struggled to conduct what we call kind of combined arms manoeuvre, particularly at large scale. So that's manoeuvring, using your different weapon systems, all of those sort of things in concert to maximise their attack. They struggled with that last year because of the difficulty of actually taking the time to train people and to having the equipment for last year's counteroffensive. That is what has been compounded by the fact that they have been short, particularly of artillery ammunition and air defence missiles, which meant that the Russians have been able to keep the pressure on and then have now launched their own attacks.
And Matthew, what do you make of, obviously at the moment we're seeing Russia making some significant gains in the northeast of Ukraine, particularly in Kharkiv Oblast. President Zelensky has come out and said that it's under control for the time being, but that Ukraine only has around a quarter of the air defence capacity required to hold the front line. So what is your reading on where this Russian offensive may go from here?
So I think there is a question about how significant in terms of grounds taken the Russian advances are around Kharkiv. Essentially what happened was around the 10th of May they launched a series of attacks across the border from Belgorod Oblast into the area northeast of Kharkiv. And it's relatively close to the border, so probably 30 to 40 kilometres in terms of its proximity. And it seems like they have captured now a number of small towns and villages, and they seem to at least be in Vovchansk. And so they have advanced maybe 10, maybe 15 kilometres, still short of the outskirts of Kharkiv itself. But that is happening concurrently with that pressure that is being applied along the rest of the front. So some pressure on in the south, particularly around Zaporizhia, and particularly around the Donbass, aiming at Chasiv Yar. And so the significance of what's happening in the north is that this doesn't look like the Russian counter-offensive or offensive or whatever. And it might only evolve around a few thousand, 4,000 or more personnel, but they've got plenty on the other side of the border. But what it is doing is it's forcing the Ukrainians to commit some kind of force around Kharkiv, and they might be having to pull forces from elsewhere along the line. I mean, they prefer to do that from locally, but Kharkiv is their second city, and so they don't really want to lose that. And it's sucking up probably artillery and air defences that the Ukrainians would rather position elsewhere. I mean, Kharkiv is already subject to repeated airstrikes and drone attacks. But if the Russians could advance a bit further and dig in, they could bring it back in range of their standard sort of tube artillery. And that hasn't been the case since the Ukrainian assault around Kharkiv in September of 2022.
There's been a lot of talk about Russia trying to create a buffer zone in the northeast to try and limit the extent to which Ukraine can strike targets inside Russia. Do you think that's what is happening at the moment, or is this more an attempt to push potentially all the way to Kharkiv city?
So they probably don't have the forces currently to take Kharkiv, although they've got fairly significant reserves, and Russian forces overall in Ukraine are probably now over 500,000. So their mobilization has enabled them to bolster what they've got, even if they're not particularly well trained. Creating that additional pressure and taking territory does push the Ukrainians back. And obviously the Russians are concerned about what the Ukrainians have been able to do in terms of striking into Russia, into around Belgorod. And it makes it that much harder. But not least, it removes Ukrainian artillery from the equation if they go far enough, although the Ukrainians still have long-range drones that they've been using.
And General Siersky, Ukraine's military commander-in-chief, has also said in recent days that his troops are prepared for a possible Russian offensive in Sumy Oblast. Do you think that is likely? And if it does happen, is that again designed to try and divert Ukrainian troops?
I mean, yes, it's slightly difficult to know sort of what's happening on a day-to-day basis because there's a little bit of a lag of information and a lot of what comes out is not necessarily complete. But in terms of the build-up of Russian forces around the area and that approach of putting pressure on and making the Ukrainians thin their lines, Sumy is certainly an option, and it would enable them to put pressure on Kharkiv and other areas from another direction.
You mentioned a moment ago, Matthew, the issue that Ukraine has been having around mobilization and getting fresh recruits onto the front line. Obviously, in recent days, Ukraine's new mobilization law has come into effect, which means that the age men can be drafted has been lowered from 27 to 25. How big a difference do you think that will make?
So this is an area where it's genuinely difficult to know. It should bring thousands more, tens of thousands more, maybe more recruits into play. But in truth, the scale of the sort of displacement of the population and some of the other challenges that they face means it's difficult to know exactly how many people that would definitively add to what the Ukrainians currently have. I mean, some of the estimates in terms of the number of people that they have under arms at the moment stretch up towards maybe 800,000. So they already have quite a lot of personnel available, although that includes a variety of forces. The big challenge is really not quite the numbers, but the training. And that has been a significant challenge. So this new mobilisation law, those new people who, if they are called up effectively or conscripted, then they could go through a pretty rapid training cycle, not dissimilar to the basic infantry training that the UK provides over here. But that only provides essentially minimally trained basic infantry, and that is not really the issue that the Ukrainians have faced. It's training their higher headquarters, training those personnel in more specialist areas, and then training them to operate as a large coordinated force.
And one of the questions you see sometimes is, well, why only 25? Why doesn't Ukraine lower its conscription age to 21 or even younger? What are the challenges when it comes to the age at which you call people up?
Oh, well, I mean, this is essentially the cause of significant internal debate inside the country. I mean, fundamentally, when Ukraine is calling up the younger parts of its population, it is calling up its future as it sees it. And although it is, as it rightly sees, in an existential fight, every person that is putting into the front line is a potential casualty who won't therefore be around in the future. It's also a lot of the rest of the population who are keeping the economy going. And in that respect, part of the challenge is fighting whilst not giving the Russians essentially what they want, which is to render Ukraine a sort of a non-functioning state.
And of course, there's issues around recruitment, but then you also have to talk about issues around retention. And according to reports, Ukraine is going to drop a potential new law which would have allowed people to have the option of being discharged after 36 months of service. I suppose that plays into the growing concern about morale on the front line for Ukraine, which, for the 2 years or so of the war so far since the full-scale invasion has been seen to be very good, certainly in comparison to the Russians. How big an issue do you think there is around that at the moment, Matthew?
I mean, again, it's another area where it's difficult to know for certain, and it's probably not uniform. Up until now, obviously, the Ukrainians have been extremely highly motivated because of the nature of the fight that they are in. There was clearly some impact on the back of the expectations not being met last year over the counter-offensive. And then, critically, the delay in terms of the most recent set of international support will have introduced a lot of doubt over essentially Western, US, European commitment to their cause. And we've seen some of the criticism in terms of the initial delay and then whether sufficient materiel is being given. Some of that material is now reaching the front line and is reported to be doing so, will help bolster morale. I think it's important to note it's not going to close the gap in terms of, for example, artillery. Russian production has been running up for some time now, but it gives the Ukrainians more of a fighting chance. It means there'll be less, although not no, rationing of ammunition along the front line. They're still, however, going to have to look at what their expectations are for this year and probably face up to the fact that there will be some further loss of territory. And so a lot of their challenge will be maintaining morale, working out which territory they can cede without giving up too much of an advantage. That's some of the challenge around Savill because of the high ground that it occupies, and where else they can consolidate their lines and pull people off the front line, both to give them a break, but also to be part of that retraining effort.
I want to come on to the issue around Western military aid for Ukraine in just a moment and what more is needed. Just on mobilisation, Matthew, when do you think we'll hear more about a potential fresh wave of Russian mobilisation?
So, I mean, it seems like Russian mobilisation has been underway for quite some time because they have been able to absorb pretty significant casualties over the past few months, which have spiked again with the assault around Kharkiv. So we were looking at casualties maybe in excess of 20,000, maybe 30,000 a month. I mean, that's killed and injured. But those are pretty significant numbers in the recent history of this conflict. I mean, historically, obviously, there have been huge casualties. That is not full Russian mobilization. And so there are more waves that they could go for if they felt it necessary. That's one of the slight challenges in that they have a significant body on which to draw. So they're probably keeping their powder dry for now because they have, as I mentioned earlier, already managed to boost just the force inside Ukraine over 500,000.
Let's come on to the issue of Western military support for Ukraine. It was interesting that we've now had the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, come out and say that she would like to see Ukraine supplied with longer range weapons to actually be able to strike Russian targets. There's been this ongoing debate about whether Ukraine should be allowed to use Western weapons inside Russia. And notable that it was the German Foreign Minister, because there is a tension within the German coalition, it would seem, over the issue of supplying Taurus missiles. Do you sense that Germany is slowly moving closer towards supplying those?
So I'm not really a sort of an expert on the internal mechanics of the German system, but as you say, that does reflect an internal debate that's been going on, where there seems to be some very strong resistance in parts of the German system, and other areas are essentially feel that they should be following the lead that's been taken by the UK with Storm Shadow, the French with Scout, and now some of the US longer range systems that have come in. So it's difficult to know whether or not the Germans will effectively authorise, first of all, providing, for example, Taurus in the first place, and then whether there'll be any restrictions on using it. But in essence, that approach that's been taken across the international coalition, which is that somebody normally goes first on a system and that essentially sets a new mark for everyone to step up to, is in play.
And just on the Taurus and their virtues, I mean, I've read a lot of people saying that they would be more effective than the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, for example, at hitting bunkers and bridges. Why is that?
So I think Taurus is fundamentally a slightly more modern, similar kind of missile. It has a slightly longer range, so it's a similar air launch standoff cruise missile, which is designed to be essentially, you launch it from an aircraft, you're hopefully outside the enemy air defences, and then it goes in at relatively low level. So what it's got is a longer range than Storm Shadow, and a lot of the speculation is therefore about, could the Ukrainians use it to attack the Kerch Bridge, for example, because that's quite a difficult target for jets launching Storm Shadow and Scout. They have to get a lot closer to Russian air defences. So those are the advantages is that it provides. It could do a reasonable amount of damage to that. Storm Shadow and Scout, Storm Shadow in particular, is an excellent bunker buster already. So it's really about hitting that large static target, which would, in any case, would be an extraordinarily difficult target for cruise missiles of that type anyway, just because of its mass. You would probably have to launch quite a lot at it to damage it. So I think that the Ukrainians will have in mind the kind of targets they want to use use it against. It might not be that the bridge is number one on the priority list.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, were, for example, the US and other Western allies to essentially remove any restrictions on how Western supplied weapons can be used by Ukraine, what would be top on the Ukrainian priority list? Where would they target first, do you think?
Well, so a lot of the targets they would want to use those cruise missiles against are actually essentially inside Ukraine, or Ukrainian territory as we recognise it. So Crimea, where there was some nervousness early on about targeting, but the UK has essentially said is completely within scope for Storm Shadow. So a lot of the success that we've seen is against those similar kind of targets. I mean, as I say, Kerch Bridge could be on that list because of the increased range. A lot of it would also be weapons supply, bunkers, and those sorts of things. I think the challenge is that what we've seen so far from essentially the deep strike campaign is that it is there to complement what happens along the front line, not replace it. So what we saw last year was a lot of very successful attacks on ships in the Black Sea Fleet, arms dumps, headquarters, the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters, but also Russian army headquarters. That caused significant damage, although the Russians are adapting with their air defences. These missiles still sometimes get through if they're accompanied by other kinds of attacks. However, that hasn't led to a collapse in Russian forces on the front line, because although it's their headquarters being hit and it's their arms dumps being hit, they're still able to fight and manoeuvre along the front. And so, in essence, that kind of deep strike campaign needs to complement what happens at the front line, which is still largely about armoured warfare, artillery, and increasingly drones.
And Matthew, when it comes to Ukraine using Western-supplied weapons behind Russian lines, which weapons would be most effective?
So this is where you get into sort of complementing some of the operations that the Ukrainians are already conducting. So they're using drones from a variety of sources, so probably hugely domestically produced, but there's obviously been Western input into some of those systems against airfields and energy infrastructure, particularly that's directly supporting the Russian military over the border. But those drone attacks, they sometimes effectively they get shot down. It seems like they've conducted a pretty successful sabotage campaign across the border as well. Where Western support might come in handy, it would probably be along the lines of the longer range artillery, and particularly ATACMS, because you could try and launch, for example, cruise missiles against those targets. But again, you've got to take a lot of risk with the aircraft to get them close, and there's Russian air defences that would effectively threaten those aircraft. Whereas firing long-range artillery, there's still a chance that the Russians could shoot down those incoming rockets, but particularly the ones with cluster warheads, they could be used to hit the airfields where Russian aircraft are based that are conducting the strikes back into Ukraine. That's particularly true of those sites, for example, where the aircraft that are launching the glide bombs come from. One of the reasons why those pose such a significant challenge for the Ukrainians is that they've got a reasonable standoff distance, maybe 30 to 40 kilometres, but they're very hard to shoot down in both the numbers and how they operate. They're very difficult to detect. And the Russians have been using those to pretty devastating effect, not just on civilian locations, but actually on the front lines. And so the best bet for the Ukrainians is either to shoot those jets down before they launch the weapons, and you could do that if you were prepared to push, for example, Patriot further forward and then launch against Russian aircraft in Russian airspace. Or, if you've got long-range artillery, destroy the aircraft on the ground before they take off. So those are some of the areas where Western-supplied weapons could complement some of the systems that the Ukrainians have got themselves.
I wanted to ask you about the military leadership of Ukraine, because it's a few months now since General Zaluzhny was replaced by General Siersky. Have we seen any significant difference in either strategy or tactics since then?
Not hugely, but in many respects that's because of the impact of the last 6 to 12 months, is that the Russians have probably got the initiative now. And so what we're actually seeing is effectively the Ukrainians having to put themselves on the defensive. And that's quite a challenging mindset change. Some of the suggestions about what happened up near Kharkiv is that the kind of fortifications and defences that they need to put in place weren't there. And that's what enabled the kind of that early, slightly shocking Russian advance. I think we need to take that with a bit of a pinch of salt, because defending right on the border, as it were, building all of those fortifications, all of that would have been done under the glare of Russian surveillance drones, of their artillery sitting across the border inside Russia, and their drones, particularly their first-person view drones. So the idea that the Ukrainians could have assembled, essentially untroubled, an extensive defensive belt right on the borders, probably unrealistic. So the real question is, what have they got in place further back around Kharkiv itself to kind of slow up that advance? There was some reporting from early in the year which suggested that they were later than they would have liked in putting up those defences, and that's where a lot of the effort has gone in subsequently to try and effectively accelerate creating those physical barriers.
And equally, there's been a significant change, okay, not in the military leadership, but in the political leadership at the Ministry of Defense in Russia, with Sergei Shoigu moving out and Andrei Belousov coming in. How much significance do you place on that?
So, I mean, again, there's a whole metaphorical army out there of Kremlinologists who can tell you what that says about what's going on around Putin. It doesn't really appear, or is unlikely to change the course of the war and the conduct in terms of sort of tactics and operations. There is some speculation, and particularly some of the people much more expert than me, that essentially by picking the Minister of Defence that he has, that is a signal that Russia is, if you like, preparing for a long war with, an increased industrial push, the kind of economic sacrifices necessary to keep funding and keep going. So there might be some signalling there. But in terms of what's happening around the front line, that kind of fight, that has its own, if you like, rhythm, own measure, countermeasure, battle, an evolution effectively in the kind of technology and tactics that they're using that is, if you like, in some respects, independent of whoever the Minister of Defence is.
Looking ahead, what would constitute a successful next few months for Ukraine? What is their best case scenario?
In the wildly optimistic situation, it would be that the Russians don't take any more ground and they can eject this kind of lodgement that's north of Kharkiv. But I suspect a successful next few months, successful year, is where they cede as little ground as possible and effectively blunt the Russian advance. So, in other words, they can make decisions under their timing and under their in support of their interests about where to cede ground. But in doing so, they bleed the Russians, and they cause the Russians to expend those additional people and extra materiel in such a way as to really bite into what's happening. I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that the Russians, first of all, their casualties have spiked around Kharkiv, so as we can tell, so they're well in excess of that sort of 1,000 a day that they were previously suffering and could sustain. The second thing is, whilst their industry and both their munitions production and their materiel production has gone up considerably, a significant chunk of that, and our researchers estimate around 80%, of the vehicles and material coming on the front line is refurbished. So they're pulling stuff out of stocks. And it seems possible that by the time you get deep into 2025, they'll have to do another industrial reset, because at that point they'll have to start producing new artillery. For example, artillery barrels are a key challenge alongside munition. Well, they're going to have to start producing new ones. They're going to have to start producing new armoured vehicles, because they're going back as far as the 1960s for some of what they've been pulling out literally of museums. And that's where the Ukrainians, if they can build up a sufficiently resourced and well-trained force, could potentially make headway if they can learn the lessons of 2023.
That's really interesting. So you may find yourself in a situation in the not too distant future where Ukraine have a significant advantage when it comes to the advancement of their supplies.
Yes, for next year, and I think that's the other. That will be a significant challenge in terms of, again, expectation management and morale. It seems unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely, an effective counterattack could be mounted, or counteroffensive could be mounted this year by the Ukrainians. It was already looking difficult, but the delays to material coming in, and again, mobilising and training to the right level enough people means that the idea that we're going to see some huge push by the Ukrainians this year, short of a window, an opportunity, or Russian errors opening up, it's probably not going to happen. And so they do need to be thinking about now about how they can assemble and preserve a force for next year rather than this year. And so this year should really be about, if you like, blunting the Russians, such as that they pay a disproportionate cost for what look like advances they're going to make. And that will be true across the line. So thinking about continuing to hit the Black Sea Fleet, thinking about how they can inflict casualties upon the Russian Air Force, all of those sorts of things.
Matthew Savill, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
No problem.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.